Good morning and welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress. I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and now we'll continue where we left off yesterday in the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We were talking about the marriage of Mary, Bloody Mary, with Philip II of Spain, which was nothing but a marriage of convenience, a marriage of religio-political importance to the Vatican in order to get control of England. And the author, R.W. Thompson, describes Philip as sullen, morose, and selfish. And Philip separated himself from everything in life calculated to encourage good or benevolent emotions, and gave free play to that bad ambition which led him to desolate the Netherlands by cruelties as unparalleled as they were atrocious. He was a killer. He was a Roman Catholic fanatic, a religious bigot, and a persecutor of the saints. He said he had no affection for Mary, being incapable of any such emotion. His marriage with her was a matter of policy alone, one of those political unions which in the course of time had produced evils to all the governments of Europe. He had inherited religious fanaticism from his father, Charles V, but without any of the better qualities of the latter. And let me tell you, there were few good qualities of Charles V, and it gave such excessive indulgence to his hatred of Protestants that nothing rejoiced him so much as to know that the dungeons of the Inquisition were crowded with them, and that none of them escaped. None of them escaped the rack, the thumbscrew, and the flames. The best people in England, Roman Catholics as well as Protestants, had feared, when this ill-fated marriage was proposed, that the bloody scenes so often witnessed on the continent would be repeated there in England, and for that reason opposed it. But state policy prevailed, and the popular will was of no avail. England, thus united with Spain because of the marriage between Mary and Philip, became subject to the influence of Philip, who employed it over Mary to make her, like himself, the obedient instrument of papal outrages. So this was a calculated move on Philip's part in concert with the papacy to get control of Mary, to thus get control of England, and to openly persecute Protestants, to establish Roman Catholicism, monarchism, and tyranny in England. Now, English persecution hitherto had one distinguishing characteristic. It is this, that Henry VIII, remember, Henry VIII was the one who fell out of favor with the papacy and made himself, as it were, the Pope of England against the papacy. It says that Henry VIII had visited his vengeance upon both Protestants and Roman Catholics, who were bound alike to the stake and burned to death because of resistance to his royal power and assumed right, in imitation of the Pope, to hold the consciences of individuals in subjugation. Elizabeth knew all this. Her strong and sagacious mind was penetrating enough to foresee that unless this disheartening course of events could be in some way changed, England would remain where Mary had left her, a mere appendage to the papacy, and thereby reduced to a condition of inferiority among the nations from which she might never recover. When Philip proposed to marry Elizabeth, when Philip proposed to marry Elizabeth, remember, Philip was Elizabeth's sister's husband, Mary, Bloody Mary. And this same Philip, after the death of Mary, is proposing to marry Elizabeth. It says, when Philip proposed to marry Elizabeth, for whom he had no more affection than he had for her sister, she was brought to realize, if she had not already done so, that the future destiny of England was mainly in her hands. From motives of policy, she took time to deliberate before accepting or rejecting this proposition of marriage by Philip. Whilst holding it under advisement, she suggested that it would violate the church law, inasmuch as their relationship brought them within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. All right, it would have been a violation of church law for Philip to marry Mary's sister, Elizabeth. Okay, it would have been prohibited by canon law. And it says, but when Philip proposed that he would obtain a dispensation from the Pope, she saw at once that it was a well-matured scheme to bring her to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the Pope over English affairs of state, and consequently declined Philip's proposal. In other words, Elizabeth acknowledged and recognized that her marriage to Philip would have been a violation of Roman Catholic canon law. And when Philip said that, well, that's not a problem, I'll just get a dispensation from the Pope, she automatically knew that Philip was in bed with the Pope, and that it was a plan and a scheme to get control of the government of England. And she declined the offer of marriage. Now, and it says, and thus was broken the alliance between the two crowns of England and Spain, and Elizabeth was left to protect herself against foreign interference in taking care of the internal affairs of her own country. The occasion demanded that she should assert herself by taking the affairs of her nation in her own hands, and the result has long since proved how well and conspicuously she did so. Elizabeth was wise. Her bitterest enemies concede this. While she may have inclined to Protestantism, she had not, at least at the beginning of her reign, acquired any positive dislike to the Roman Catholic religion. On the contrary, the Roman Catholic bishops and lords were disposed to regard her exhibition of tolerance as indicating that she would at last act with justice and impartiality toward them. Camden, the historian, says that during Mary's reign, Elizabeth had intimated to Cardinal Pole that she had a dispensation in preference to Roman Catholicism. However, this may have been, she not only sometimes attended confession, but assisted at divine service after the manner of the Roman Catholic Church. Lingard says, quote, she continued to assist and occasionally to communicate at Mass. She buried her sister with all the solemnities of the Catholic ritual, and she ordered a solemn dirge and a mass of requiem for the soul of the Emperor Charles V. Influenced by these considerations, and probably by others of the same character, the House of Lords, and remember the House of Lords was almost entirely Roman Catholic. They represented the rich ruling elite, the priesthood, and the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. It says, influenced by these considerations and probably by others of the same character, the House of Lords, the Roman Catholic House of Lords, composed entirely of Roman Catholics, declared in her favor, and the Commons, which represented the people, having readily and unanimously approved their decision, she was proclaimed queen, quote, with the acclamations of the people, unquote. Thus her right to the crown was settled by the highest authority in the kingdom. There was not a murmur of discontent. Some regretted the death of Mary, but there was a general desire that the barbarities practiced during her reign should cease. In that desire, Elizabeth manifestly shared, as is well established by the fact already stated that she retained 13 of Mary's counselors and appointed only 8 Protestants to the council. She could have meant nothing else by this than to express the desire that religious persecution should cease, and that the two religious parties should in the future live in peace with each other and thus enable the country to develop into greatness. The first attack upon her to the crown was made by Henry II of France and not by her Roman Catholic subjects. Henry was thoroughly indoctrinated with the persecuting spirit which prevailed in France among the defenders of the papacy and was dominated over by the Guises, one of whom was the Cardinal of Lorraine, a patron of the Jesuits. His persecution of the reformers had been previously mentioned. In assailing the title of Elizabeth, Henry II had undoubtedly several objects in view, the chief of which were to humiliate England and probably establish French sovereignty over it, to continue the policy of Mary, Bloody Mary, in persecuting the Protestants, and to place the crown of Elizabeth upon the head of Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether one or all of these motives influenced him, he solicited the aid of the Pope and made himself a party to the conspiracy against the peace of England by endeavoring to obtain a papal decree that Elizabeth was a bastard and therefore not lawfully queen. Here we go again, the pot calling the kettle black. You know, it was one time said that Rome was the only city on earth that was run by bastards. That the entire Roman Catholic hierarchy were the product of priests and popes. They were a pope would have illicit relations with one or dozens of women, and their offspring were secretly brought into the church as cardinals. Even some of them as young as 9, 10, 11 years old, brought in and made cardinals. The entire city was ruled by the illicit offspring of popes. The city was ruled literally by bastards. And here we have the papacy trying to unseat Elizabeth because she was not the product of Henry VIII and Catherine, but Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who was not approved by the papacy. They were endeavoring to obtain a papal decree that Elizabeth was a bastard and therefore not lawfully queen. Consequently, when, after her rejection of Philip's proposal of marriage, she saw the Roman Catholic powers with the Pope at their head conspiring against her, she resolved that her own safety and that of England required her to dismiss the Roman Catholic members of her council, declare her purpose to protect and encourage the Reformed religion, and submit the matter to the people by means of a parliament to be assembled for that purpose. Now take note, I'm not just a carte blanche champion of Elizabeth. She didn't take these steps of removing Catholics out of her council until it was politically advantageous to her, until she was well aware that the papacy was trying to unseat her, and that they would no doubt use the Catholics in her council to overthrow her rule. Now, many people in this research are just give Elizabeth a pass, but nonetheless, she was a consummate politician, and she used the power of the Roman Catholic Church to advance herself, and only opposed Rome when it became politically advantageous. She was never, as far as I'm concerned, a true devout Protestant. Nonetheless, she favored Protestantism, and she sought peace with Roman Catholics. She sought peace with error. Now, this precautionary measure was most commendable inasmuch as it proposed to submit to Parliament the question whether or no the two religions were equally entitled to legal protection. In that her purpose might be fully understood, she issued a proclamation allowing divine service to be performed in the English tongue, and the scriptures to be read by the laity, a privilege hitherto denied. Okay, so it was always said in Latin, right? I mean, this is the Roman Catholic form. And also, it allowed the scriptures to be read by the laity. Well, that was typical Protestantism, so how Protestant could England have been if the people were not allowed to read the scriptures? Now, it says, in order to allay all undue excitement, she expressly prohibited religious, quote, controversy by preaching, unquote, until the meeting of Parliament. So she's going to let Parliament decide this issue, whether both religions should be protected by the state, Protestantism and Catholicism, and she didn't want anybody preaching from the pulpit one way or another until Parliament weighed in. Now it says, when the new Parliament did assemble, it was addressed in her behalf by the keeper of the Great Seal, who announced to the representatives of the people that the Queen had commanded him to exhort them, quote, to take a mean between the two extremes of superstition and irreligion, that is, to take a middle-of-the-road position between the two extremes of superstition, that is, Roman Catholicism, and, quote, irreligion. And you can only assume that they're referencing Protestantism here as irreligion, which might reunite the partisans of both the one and the other religion in the same public worship. Okay? Let me read it again without interruption. When the new Parliament did assemble, it was addressed in her behalf by the keeper of the Great Seal, who announced to the representatives of the people that the Queen had commanded him to exhort them to, quote, to take a mean between the two extremes of superstition and irreligion, which might reunite the partisans of both at the one and the other religion in the same public worship, unquote. The conciliatory course of Elizabeth, as indicated by her proclamation and this address to Parliament, exhibited a degree of liberality to which the English people had been unaccustomed during the reign of Mary. It is a reasonable supposition that if her suggestion had been accepted in the spirit in which it was offered, England would have bounded forward far more rapidly than she did to the condition she subsequently reached through severe and protracted trials. The times were suited to the introduction of compromising measures of peaceful policy. The people were tired of commotion, persecution, and bloodshed on account of religious differences, and would readily have acquiesced in any amicable plan of adjustment. But unfortunately for England and the world as well, neither the interests nor the wishes of the people were of sufficient avail to bring quiet to the country. The course of subsequent events may be easily traced. The papal machinery of church government had been so constructed at Rome that in order to keep the people in subjection, it had deposited unlimited powers in the hands of the Roman Catholic prelates. Here we have the deal buster. The Pope has injected himself, given unlimited power to the Roman Catholic prelates of the church, and they're going to make sure that no peace is ever arrived at in England, especially under Elizabeth's reign. It says the Roman Catholic bishops of England, as well as elsewhere, had been accustomed to rule with a rod of iron, and the time had not arrived when they could be reconciled to any diminution of their ecclesiastical authority. They became, quote-unquote, alarmed, says historian Lingard, at the position taken by Elizabeth. They undoubtedly viewed it only in its relation to themselves and the interests of the Church of Rome, or rather of the papacy, without bestowing a moment's thought about the general welfare of England. They regarded conciliation as a form of heresy not to be tolerated. there was going to be no conciliation by the Roman Catholic hierarchy in England. Not so long as the Pope was in control, not so long as the Jesuits were in control, the Roman Catholic Church will never conciliate or give 1 inch of ground or one mere compromise for the order of peace when it goes against the laws of the Church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church considers it to be the only Church of Jesus Christ. And they believe they have a divine right to rule the world. And they're not about to make concessions for the sake of peace in England in favor of Protestantism. It's just not going to happen. Now, what they desired was the extirpation of Protestantism and the unity of the Roman Catholic Church, assured by the establishment of its religion to the exclusive of any dissenting faith. In other words, all Catholicism, supported by the government, and then the elimination of any Protestant influence. Complete destruction, extirpation, and annihilation of Protestants in England. If the Pope, the Jesuits, the Roman Catholic hierarchy in England had had their way, there would have been an Inquisition in England, the likes of which the world had never previously seen. Okay? And it says, accordingly, they assembled themselves together to consult, quote, whether they could in conscience officiate at the coronation, unquote, of a queen who proposed so to adjust religious differences as to put an end to all interference with the right of individuals to freedom of conscience. Okay? They viewed her, Elizabeth, as someone who championed religious liberty, freedom of conscience. In other words, opposed Roman Catholicism by simply granting religious liberty and freedom of conscience to the people. And this so outraged the divine right attitudes of the Roman Catholic Church and the hierarchy there that they simply wouldn't participate in her coronation. They didn't want any compromise with Protestants. Heretics, as they were viewed. Now it says, upon various pretexts, they decided not to attend or to take part in the ceremony of coronation. Consequently, the ceremony was performed with the attendance of only one single bishop and was made, quote, to conform to all the rites of the Catholic pontifical, unquote. In other words, it was still a Catholic service. It says, this decision and conduct of the bishops, quote, created considerable embarrassment, unquote, and might have produced serious consequences but for the withdrawal of this single bishop from his associates. The non-attendance of Roman Catholic bishops upon the coronation of Elizabeth was a signal for opening the old strife. This is how they incited religious discord. They simply refused to participate in the coronation of Elizabeth. And that's how they incited the old religious strife among the people of England. Now, I see we've come up on the break. We'll continue with the reading of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, when we return from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Record budget deficits, bankruptcies galore, and the U.S. dollar is at an all-time low. With today's gloomy economic outlook, safe investments are often hard to find. For over a decade, Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company has been helping people secure their future by investing in the precious metals. Melody has the honesty, integrity, and experience that is often lacking in the precious metals business. Let her put it to work for you. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you wish to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, we're talking about an effort by the Roman Catholic bishops to incite religious strife in England simply by not showing up to the coronation of Protestant Queen Elizabeth. And it resulted in a message being received by Protestants and Catholics alike, stirring up the old religious strife in England simply by not showing up to her coronation. Oh, by the way, just a piece of trivia before we continue on with the reading of the book. It's reported, many report that the first telephone call that Barack Hussein Obama received after being voted into the White House was from Pope Benedict XVI congratulating him. If that means anything in the context of what we're talking about, yes, Barack Obama is a papal king, and I don't care how much the press try to paint him as a Muslim or any other faith. He serves the papacy, and if he doesn't serve the papacy, he'd be one dead black boy. Trust me. He serves the papacy just like all the kings of the earth. Now, the non-attendance, says R.W. Thompson, the non-attendance of the Roman Catholic bishops upon the coronation of Elizabeth was a signal for opening the old strife. It was unquestionably intended upon their part to array their followers in opposition to the conciliatory measures of the Queen. Now what does this mean in terms of Vatican Council II, where the papacy decided not to call us heretics anymore, but separated brethren? Do you think Rome's really changed? History is going to prove Rome hasn't changed one whit. And Vatican Council II was a Trojan horse to get alliances with the leaders of the evangelical world in order to destroy them. The ultimate goal of the papacy is to silence every potential Protestant voice in this country. We've already covered the history of France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, England, and soon we're going to go into India in our discussion in this book. And Protestantism has always been the target of the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Jesuits, ever since the founding of the Jesuits in 1540. Vatican Council II was, just as I described it, a Trojan horse. You know, I liken it to what the Roman Catholic Church did just before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. All kinds of lovey-dovey between Protestants and Catholics, and then one night, with no warning whatsoever, at the sound of the ringing of the church bells, the Catholics rose up and slew all the Protestants. That's exactly what Vatican Council II was. Just a bunch of phony lovey-dovey between the papacy and the evangelicals in this country. Mark it down. History's about to repeat itself. Those who have any faith whatsoever in an ecumenical reunion with the Roman Catholic Church, it's going to boil down to this: forcible conversion to Rome or else. And that else can be spelled in B-L-O-O-D, blood. That's how Rome seals her fate. She's drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. That's Bible prophecy. That can't be, she can't repudiate her prophetic role in the world. And she's bound to it. So Vatican Council II is a false hope. Now, it says the non-attendance of the Roman Catholic bishops upon the coronation of Elizabeth was a signal for the opening of the old strife. It was unquestionably intended upon their part to array their followers in opposition to the conciliatory measures of the Queen, the ecumenical measures of the Queen, and it did not take long in those days to be so understood upon both sides. The consequence was that the public excitement was imparted to Parliament and led to the repeal of several of the statutes of Mary and the substitution for them of others, whereby the Reformed religion was made national and penalties prescribed for refusing so to recognize it. This, of course, led to severe measures and to persecution in imitation of the example set during the reign of Mary, and produced the unfortunate condition of affairs with which all readers of English history are familiar. Upon which side, during the long controversy that followed, the responsibility rested most heavily is not easily decided. Wrongs were undoubtedly inflicted on both sides, but whatsoever these were, they grew out of a spirit of that age, and had their origin, as we have seen, in the influences created by the papacy, aided by Jesuit intrigues. They're not going to tolerate religious peace. They're going to incite religious war. What is one of the Roman Catholic prelates said? The Roman Catholic Church is more dynamic in war than it is in peace. The Roman Catholic Church has always used war and conflict to better her position in the world. So they incite these wars. War is an asset. War is a necessity in order to advance the sword of the Pope. Now it says, the fact, however, which most nearly concerns our present inquiries is what has just been stated, that the first step taken in the direction toward the renewal of religious agitation was the organized opposition of the bishops to Elizabeth, formed for the purpose of defeating the measures of pacification she had proposed to Parliament. It is impossible not to have known that the defeat of those measures by the combined opposition of the bishops would lead to a revival of the hatreds which had been encouraged under Mary, and therefore to oppose them was to invite that revival for which, consequently, these bishops were responsible. Whether the Protestants would have accepted or rejected the proposition of Elizabeth cannot now be decided with positive certainty. All the probabilities indicate that they would have accepted them. One thing, however, is certain. They were rejected by the Roman Catholics under the lead of their bishops. This, of course, revived the old animosities, but with increased violence. Throughout all the departments of society, passion became greatly intensified. Nevertheless, the questions involved were English questions alone. They were primarily and chiefly political, although having political religious aspects. But they involved only the internal and domestic condition of England. No alien or foreign power had the right, by international or other law, or consistently with what is now universal usage among civilized nations, to interfere with them. But we have seen that they were interfered with not only by a direct attempt to make the policy of the country conform to that dictated by a foreign power, the papacy, but in the threatening form of a conspiracy between the King of France and the Pope to impeach the title of Elizabeth upon the ground that she was a bastard, to which she could not have submitted without disgrace. We have also seen how this conspiracy moved stealthily forward step by step until she was tried at Rome by an alien tribunal, pronounced a usurper by a decree which declared her crown to have been forfeited, and her subjects released from their natural and lawful allegiance. And in order that her escape from the wrath and vengeance of the Pope should become impossible, swarms of incendiary Jesuits were turned loose upon the country to fan the flames of discord, stir up rebellion and civil war, and carry into execution the judgment and sentence of the papal court at Rome. They're going to do the will of the papacy, whether Elizabeth or the whole nation stands against them. Now remember, all of these things are given for our example. What are the Jesuits and the papacy capable of doing in this heretical nation, according to their viewpoint? Surely the papacy sees the government of the United States just as heretical as he saw the Elizabethan government. No peace and unity with Protestants. They want war. As soon as opportunity presents itself where they can make and wage relentless war with all hope of success, that's exactly what they intend to do. A leopard cannot change its spots. We have nearly 1,800 years of history, Roman Catholic history, to study. And out of all of that information, out of all of that knowledge, out of all of that history, we can pretty safely assume Rome is never going to acquiesce to any kind of an ecumenical union with Protestants. It's not going to happen. Now it says, if Elizabeth erred in defending herself and her kingdom against this formidable and dangerous combination, her error was upon the side of patriotism, and she is scarcely censurable for it, inasmuch as the life of the nation and probably her own life were the stake for which her enemies were playing. And whether it be true or not that the Jesuits attempted her assassination, as some historians allege, it must be accepted in her praise that although a woman, she taught her assailants that she was every inch a queen, and that England under her reign became enabled to convince all these rival powers that she was competent to conduct her own affairs and take care of herself. Facts sufficiently demonstrated by her advanced position among the modern progressive nations. Every American mind should be duly impressed by this portion of English history, showing as it does how fierce and protracted was the struggle which led in the end to popular government, and the civil and religious freedom which it alone has guaranteed. Elizabeth was undoubtedly a great queen, great in the qualities of her intellect, in the steadfastness of her purpose, in that manly courage which mounteth with occasion. When she became queen, the people of England, both Protestants and Roman Catholics, were tired of religious persecution and anxious to put an end to it. She favored and recommended to Parliament measures of pacification in the spirit of liberality and toleration. If, obeying the dictates of her own conscience, she preferred Protestantism to Roman Catholicism, she had such respect for the conscientious convictions of others as to desire that all her subjects should be secured in the right to accept either or one or the other at their own discretion. By the avowal of these and other kindred purposes, she incurred the opposition of the Roman Catholic bishops, who, in concert with foreign powers and backed by the Pope and his Jesuit militia, brought on a civil war which afflicted England with a long train of evils and calamities. Under the influence of her liberalism, the bulk of the population became tolerant of each other, and by the great unanimity with which they accepted her as queen, indicated the desire that the protection of the government should be given to both forms of worship. And it may be accepted as fair inference from what then transpired that she was defeated in her plan of conciliation only by the animosities engendered by the English bishops, the Pope, and the Jesuits. Her defeat, however, was not final, and having survived the machinations of all her enemies, even the excommunication and the anathemas of the Pope, together with the stealthy plottings of the Jesuits, the pages which record the events of her reign constitute some of the brightest in English history. They teach a philosophy that will not be forgotten so long as free, popular institutions shall continue to exist. That's the end of the chapter, but I want to ask my listeners, how many of you are aware of this English history and the machinations of the Jesuits and the papacy and the bishops against a Protestant monarch? There wasn't much said in my history books, and certainly any religious flavor for the controversies were watered down to the point of being unrecognizable. So, given what R.W. Thompson said, he says that they teach a philosophy, these facts of history, English history, they teach a philosophy that will not be forgotten so long as free, popular institutions shall continue to exist. I came up in the public school system in this country unaware of the religious strife in England between Protestantism and Catholicism. I considered myself to be brought up in a free country. But is it really free? How was it that I survived the public school system without becoming aware of the machinations of the Jesuits? How is it that I could call myself now free when it's still not taught in the public schools nor in the Protestant churches what the Jesuits have done throughout history? It says this example of England, through these examples, this English history, they teach a philosophy that will not be forgotten so long as free, popular institutions shall continue to exist. R.W. Thompson knew about this English history, about this battle between Protestantism and the Jesuits and the papacy and the Roman Catholic hierarchy in England. I was never taught this. So am I free? Who's got control of education in the country? Who's got control of the syllabus of education in the public school system And who's got control of the education that is taught in the seminaries? Why didn't my Protestant pastors tell me anything about the history between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism? Is this country really free? I submit to you it's not. And if we demand our liberties, then we first have to acknowledge who it is that challenges our liberties. They're the ones who have been written out of our history, the Jesuit order, and the Roman Catholic hierarchy, and the popes. And the First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees me the right of free speech to criticize both the Pope and the King. And that's what I do here on Inquisition Update. Point out the diabolical union between the Pope and the King. A marriage made in perdition. A union of church and state. A woman riding the beast. And condemn it for what it is, a counterfeit kingdom that calls itself Christian. It's not Christian at all. It is anti-Christian. R.W. Thompson is brilliant at bringing out the history of the Jesuits so that we can make sense out of history and the Bible and Bible prophecy. This is one of the most important volumes in my library. The History of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. It ought to be on every Protestant bookshelf. And it ought to be mandatory reading by every Protestant in this country. It ought to be mandatory reading by every Catholic, although that's going a bit too far. Never would Rome permit her people to read this book. Everybody in this country is living like everything is just Democratic versus Republican. They don't see things from a religious point of view. Never mind that the war of all wars was waged in heaven before the world was ever created. Satan tried to overthrow God's heavenly throne. And that war's been transferred to the earth. Why do Christians today see the conflict as only between Democrats and Republicans? When behind all that Democratic and Republican hoopla and controversy lies the real controversy. Truth versus error. Christ versus Antichrist. Jesuitism versus Protestantism. Satan is still trying to overthrow Christ's rightful throne. And bloodshed is the mark of his travels on the earth. And who has shed more blood, more innocent blood than the papacy? And now, since the Jesuits have been running rampant throughout the world, creating political and religious and intrigues, inciting wars, and rumors of wars, it's high time the people of the United States were educated. And then take a stand, as did England. Now we're moving on to Chapter 9. The Jesuits were influential in India. They're everywhere. It says, the reader who shall intelligently trace the history of the Jesuits through their conspiracies against the peace of Europe, and especially their tireless efforts to eradicate everything that tended to freedom of conscience and the public enlightenment, will not wonder that during the last century it became necessary to the interests of society and the Church that one of the foremost of the popes should suppress and entirely abolish the Jesuit order. And as that event was brought about, not alone on account of the odium they incurred by intermeddling with the temporal affairs of states, But because they pursued practices which shocked the whole Christian world, their society, the Jesuit order, cannot be thoroughly understood without becoming familiar with the history of their missionary enterprises. Their missionary enterprises. Yes, this militia of the Pope, the one set out by the papacy to destroy Protestantism, is also their most revered missionary sources. They have interjected themselves in all the nations of the world in the name of missionaries. That's how they get their foot in the door of every nation in the world, professing themselves to be religious missionaries, when they are in fact mercenaries, warriors for the papacy, using religion as a cloak for their nefarious military operations. It says, as they prosecuted these among ignorant and illiterate multitudes of people, where no watchful eye could observe them, they have mainly become their own historians. That's right, they write their own history. That's why the world is so ignorant about what the Jesuits are. They write their own history. They're called the great educators. Certainly, history must be written by the great educators. And so the Jesuits have control of history by being the ones who write history. He says, as they prosecuted these among ignorant and illiterate multitudes of people where no watchful eye could observe them, they have mainly become their own historians. Yet there is enough to be discovered to show that at every stage of their development, they have been true to the injunction of their founder to be all things to all men. And we'll continue with the reading of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, on the program tomorrow. We've run out of time. Email me at tom@seawaves.us, and we'll see you on the program tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.